to bring back the hostages. What is better? To give Hamas everything he wants and then continue the war? Believe me, it's not. Or to have the war and put the massive, extensive, maximum force on the Hamas leaders, their families, and get the hostages this way. I'm not saying we'll get all the hostages. And believe me, even if we'll give Hamas everything they want, we're not going to get back all those hostages. You know why?
Mainstream media gives you the impression that there is nothing good about America. In direct contrast to that, my podcasts will prove by examples that America has always been and still is the land of opportunity for everyone. Welcome to another episode in the series Life Lessons with Dr. Bob. If you've seen episodes in this series, then you know that all of my guests are quite special people. They're typically leaders in their field, and today's guest is no exception. Well, actually, my guest today is an exception because he is an acknowledged expert in two different but related fields, defense strategy and defense technology. Reflective of his two areas of expertise, my guest today, Jacob Nagel, has two titles. One is Brigadier General and the other is Professor, because he is both a defense strategist to the Israeli government and a professor at the Israel Institute of Technology, also called the Technion. General Nagel's military career spans over 4 decades, including in the Israel Defense Forces, the Ministry of Defense, and most recently in the Prime Minister's office. Professor Nagel's technical career started in 1979 when he earned his engineering degree from the Technion, and it continues there today where he is a professor of aerospace engineering. Because I'm not quite sure which title to use for him in our conversation, general or professor, I'll just call him Jacob. Now, there isn't sufficient time to list all of the increasingly important positions that Jacob has held during his career, so I'll just give you the highlights. After graduating from the Technion, Jacob joined the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, where he served for 17 years as a technical expert in the 8200 unit, which is IDF's elite organization that focuses on electronic surveillance, intelligence gathering, and cyber warfare. The 8200 is our equivalent of the NSA, the National Security Agency. By the way, the 8200 was the unit allegedly responsible, together with the U.S., for the very sophisticated cyber attack against Iran in 2010, in which a computer virus called Stuxnet was surreptitiously downloaded into the computers controlling Iran's nuclear centrifuges. That virus caused the centrifuges to operate erratically and, over time, to self-destruct. This project was successful in delaying Iran's project to create a nuclear warhead by as many as 5 years. For the next 15 years, following his tenure in the 8200, Jacob was appointed to various senior positions in the Ministry of Defense and became the head of military R&D. In that role, he chaired the Nagel Committee, responsible for selecting and recommending to the Prime Minister the funding and the development of the Iron Dome missile defense system, which went operational in 2011, and since that time has been instrumental in intercepting and destroying thousands of short-range rockets fired into Israel. Late last year, Jacob was appointed by Prime Minister Netanyahu to chair a committee to evaluate Israel's defense strategy and budgetary needs for the coming decade. This 130-page report, appropriately named the Nagel Committee Report, was presented to the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister, and the Treasury Minister just 2 months ago in January of 2025. In summary, throughout his career, Jacob Nagel has been and still is instrumental in shaping Israel's defense strategies and technological advancements, both of which have significantly enhanced the security of the State of Israel for over 40 years. It's my pleasure, actually, it's my honor to welcome Brigadier General and Professor Jacob Nagel to the show. Jacob, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased being here. I know for many years, I'm really pleased that finally we can sit and talk in your podcast.
And after this, we'll have a bit of schnapps and a l'chaim.
No problem, yes.
Jacob, before we start our conversation, I want to acknowledge that as a close advisor to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, you have information that is highly confidential. So I apologize ahead of time if I ask you anything that falls into that category.
If you will ask those categories, don't worry, I won't answer.
Now, starting in 1908, when oil was first discovered in Persia, modern-day Iran, the Middle East has been an important part of the world. And as the birthplace of the modern world's three great religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, it has also been a place of conflict. There are so many conflicts currently happening in the Middle East today. So let's dig in. Let's start with Gaza. I believe that the very high level of conflict that we're currently experiencing in the Middle East began when Hamas invaded Israel on October 7th, 2023. Now, with all of Israel's technology on the border, and with Gaza and its ongoing conflicts with between Israel and Hamas, how did this invasion happen? How did Israel not only fail to anticipate it from happening, but also why did it take the IDF so long to respond to it?
It's a very important question. I'm not sure that I have all the answers, but before we dig into Gaza and other fronts, yes, as you mentioned, we are facing now at least 6-7 fronts that Israel is facing. We have to remember that, we have Iran behind almost every bad thing that is happening in our area. They are funding, they are training, they are giving all the bad instructions. Even so that on October 7, they knew what's going on, with one exception, like every other areas, and it will start answering your question. Only 4 people on the Gaza side, on the Hamas side, knew the day and time. Everyone knew the overall plan of the Hamas.
But with so many people who knew about it, they might not have known the day and the time, of course, but they were training and practicing and getting the aerial, whatever they were, what do you call them? They weren't rockets.
Drones and Buckeyes and many instruments.
But so with all that, they were practicing. So did no one in Israel, in Shin Bet or Mossad, these famed agencies?
It's not Mossad. It's Shin Bet and the intelligence, the 8200 that I belong to. Everyone knew what they are planning, with one exception. Again, it doesn't make it easier to understand that it was a big failure, one of the biggest failure of Israel, maybe the biggest intelligence failure that we have. We knew the intelligence. The failure was the analyzing of the intelligence and making from it an actionable work. What I mean, everyone had the conception, as we said, that the Hamas want to eliminate us. They want to come in and rape and kidnap and butcher. But
they won't.
They won't. But we thought it will be in 3 or 4 years. Why? Because they are deterred, because they want to be more prepared, because they want still to work for the economy. Now, we know that the Hamas leader, they don't care about the population in Gaza. They don't care even the opposite. Sometimes they said, I don't care that people will die. As much as you can do it more, it's better for us, the leaders. But the concept was that the biggest threat will come from Hezbollah in the north and their Radwan forces, and of course from Iran, and not from Hamas and the Nukhba forces. And we thought if it will happen, it will be with a small amount of forces. This caused us to neglect some parts of the border. We had 3 layers of border control. We had the underground wall, we have the above ground wall, and we have the intelligence supervising all of it. Still, we didn't have enough soldiers there. We didn't have enough helicopters there. We didn't have enough alerting there. It was all because of the concept that it's not going to happen now. Now, the year before, they also practiced several times. Now it's known that they tried to do it in Rosh Hashanah before, and then in Passover before. They plan to do it always in a holiday, so people are mostly at home. Just the current chief of staff said, not anymore holidays, not anymore closing the bases and leaving too much
opportunity.
Not enough people in the bases. Still, Israel defense strategy from Ben Gurion is based on 4 pillars: early warning, deterrence, defense, and offense.
I see.
During 7th of October, October 7th, 2 of them totally crashed and shattered. We found out that early warning cannot work with a terror organization, especially if the other side, only 3 or 4 people know what's going to happen. They are not talking about it. They are not texting about it. They are not writing on the internet about it. So never mind if you have 1,000 people in the intelligence or 10,000 or even 100,000.
There's nothing
you
to
cannot
find out.
have intelligence if the other side is not giving it to you. And while you don't have the human intelligence, and you count too much on the electronic and the cyber, it's very important, but you cannot count only on it. And the second thing, even more important, we found out that deterrence cannot work with terror organization. It can work with countries. You cannot deter someone. They don't care. You will kill
themselves
people.
up. Yeah,
they don't care.
Right.
So how you can deter it? So we are working now very, very hard. I'm not saying that we have solutions to build a new I don't want to say to
New
call
policy.
it paradigm, a new policy, a new strategy.
Right, so let me go into that.
A new early warning and deterrence strategy and policy.
Right, so I read some of your work, and I understand that prior to October 7th, the government's policy regarding Hamas was, as you said, defense and containment. In other words, treating Hamas as a terror enterprise that Israel could defend against and could contain by making occasional limited strikes into Gaza to disrupt their plans. And I've heard it stated when I've been in Israel talking to the military, they call it pulling the weeds. Every now and then we have to go and pull the weeds. So I believe that your committee was instrumental in changing that policy to one which is proactive as opposed to responsive in nature. So the new policy is prevention and attack. So Jacob, elaborate on that very important change in Israel's national security strategy and how it will deal with Israel, how Israel will deal with its adversaries going forward, not just Gaza.
I'm really glad because you are just touching now one of the top 5 main recommendations and decision making that we did in my committee, and it changing the doctrine of containment and defense and change it to offense and prevention. Now, its meaning before was quiet at any price. We found out it's not working. Quiet is very important, but you cannot, for quiet, giving up your defense and your the security of your civilians. Now, some people are trying to compare what happened on October 7 to the Yom Kippur War intelligence failure. In the intelligence failure, they are right. It's almost the same. We had the intelligence, we didn't do the right analysis. The difference is that in Yom Kippur War, we failed soldiers. Soldiers died. Now, sometimes you can say soldiers are there to fight and sometimes die. In October 7, we failed our civilians. So civilian died. It's like some kind of a betrayal. So this is the biggest, I call it, crisis that was in October 7. Israel is not going to be the same after October 7. It will change our doctrine. It will change the way we are going to build our forces. Now, another outcome from my committee was, and it's very, very surprising and not surprising, we came to the conclusion that October 7 didn't occur or didn't happen because a lack of budget or the size of the IDF. It didn't matter. But what happened after October 7 showed us that we did a big mistake talking about, a small and smart army. It cannot work. You need smart, but big enough to defend your civilians, to defend the borders. You need enough armor, enough air force, enough navy to protect your borders and to go to attack. You cannot say that I will build my forces in order to fight in 1.5 fronts. We found out, no, you cannot allow yourself to be in this luxury. Now, the problem is that if you are going and building your forces in order to be able to fight, not in 1.5 fronts, but much more, not seven, consecutive one or, in the same time, but it costs money. It costs budget. And if you put money in defense, you have less money to put in health and in education and in infrastructure. In the end, it's the biggest problem that we faced in my committee was to balance between two very important things. One is life, and the other one is quality of life. What is more important, life or quality of life? I want both of them. But the real balance is, first of all, make sure that you are living.
You're right.
And then try to optimize the quality of life. You cannot have quality of life without having the life itself.
Right. Now, in response of the failure of the IDF to respond quickly to assist communities in order to defend themselves against Hamas, the Israeli government has recently authorized the creation of civilian security squads, Israelis who are trained and armed to be the first responders in each community. This makes so much sense. Why wasn't it done earlier?
Again, it makes much sense. I don't want to put too much emphasis on this action. It's important. It's not going to solve the problem, but it's very important to give the people, the communities, the power to defend themselves. You cannot count on it. You have to count on the IDF. You have to count on the soldiers that are going to defend your borders. It can be the compulsory service people, soldiers. It can be the career service
but still,
soldiers.
It takes time.
And can be reserved.
It takes time to get there. So you need, I think the civilian patrols offer a tremendous deterrent because they'll be able to respond very quickly.
It's very important. They can respond very quickly. There are some dangerous in those areas. And again, there are not many of them, but you are totally right. We decided that we want to count on those, but not, they are, as you said, first responders.
First responders,
The really first responders are the soldiers that are on the border itself. Those groups that are part of the communities are not on the border, but they should defend the communities itself, assuming something will happen and the enemies will enter the country. And again, the question is what kind of ammunition you give them, what kind of solutions you give it. It also costs
But I
money.
understand the
And
communities.
some of those people have to go to reserves. So are they going to reserve or are they going to remain as part of the civilian forces? So it's pros and cons.
But I understand that the communities that had their own civil patrols and that were trained and that had their weapons, they weren't locked up somewhere. They were able to defend themselves. And
Some had the capabilities. Some really an heroic fight.
Right.
But even in the places that there is an heroic fight and they saved many lives, a lot of them died.
Yeah, of course.
And of course, is that in any place that there was a group of internal
fighters,
people that have weapons and they can defend the communities, it helped until the IDF came. Now, the biggest problem, not the biggest, but one of the biggest problems of the first day, the first 12 hours, again, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, I'm saying it as a fact.
Yes.
There was a chaos. Now, the division, the Gaza division, they lost control. They will have to, we'll have to, there are checking. Now we are checking how it happened and why and how to prevent from this happening in the next part.
What do you mean they lost control?
They lost control. They didn't know what's going on. They didn't know what's going on because we were not ready, because some lack of communication, because sometimes also a failure of the commanders. Sometimes the commanders itself, they were captured or died. Even so, the division commander still was there in the headquarters in the Southern Command, but it was, even in the headquarters in Tel Aviv, in other places, it took about 12 hours to understand what's going on. For example, take the Air Force. They had two choppers. Some of those choppers really prevent some of those terrorists from coming in. But some of them, they didn't know to differentiate between terrorists and Israelis that were there. There was a big party. Sometimes there were, F-35s or F-15s. They are not suitable to fight in border
skirmish.
Choppers, yes. Now, you have to remember that before, some people said, we have to close all the helicopter squadrons in the Air Force. We don't need it. Of course, no one is talking like this today, and we just doubled now the number of helicopters that we need. We learned many lessons from what happened there. And you mentioned one of the lessons. Okay, we have to give the local communities also the forces to defend themselves until the reserves are coming. The Israeli doctrine that Ben-Gurion started is that we have a small fixed army until the reserve is coming. Most of our IDF forces is based on our reserves. So we have a huge and unproportional intelligence forces and Air Force. Intelligence, to have the early warning, that I mentioned before, failed.
But not the standing army.
And the Air Force, to make sure that we can protect our borders until the reserve are recruited. Here, it didn't work until the reserve was recruited. Until our forces came, some of our villages, kibbutzim, others, they were captured by those terrorists. We didn't anticipated 3,000 terrorists coming together, putting some between 30 to 40 holes in the fence. I'll give you another thing that failed. We built 3 layers of protection, as I mentioned: the underground wall, the upper ground, and the intelligence. Now, the underground wall was the most sophisticated one. It costed us 3 billion shekel. I'm proud that I was part of it, but it took out from the Hamas their biggest weapon, the tunnels,
right.
the penetration tunnel. But it forced them to go to the weakest part of our three-layer border defense, the upper fence that was not supposed to protect against this kind of attack, because we said, okay, the intelligence will tell us that they are coming, so we'll send the forces. Unfortunately, this part of intelligence failed. We had 3 balloons, all 3 of them didn't work the same day. We had some of the, the observers, the girls, the Hamas did something that we can learn. The first wave of attack took down our intelligence, the observing and some others. So we lost our eyes on the border, and the wall, the fence itself was not planned to stop them, so they didn't go from the underground.
Right.
So we took
Forced
from them. We took from them their biggest weapon, but we forced them to go
against
to the
our
place,
weakest.
exactly, to the weakest spot.
And they just
of
used
our
bulldozers
defense.
or
bulldozers
tractors.
and tractors, and it was open like this, and that's it.
And now, why isn't that area mined? Why aren't there landmines? Landmines make the perfect sense, right?
Remember that we wanted to be to have total freedom of action to go in and out. And if we would do landmines,
I see.
we will prevent it from ourselves.
That's
we
a
cannot
good
do
answer.
it. We cannot do it like the DMZ, the demilitarized zone
Right.
between
Because
North and South,
they don't go
North
north.
and South
We-
Korea.
we-
Exactly. We don't have enough.
Right.
We don't have mine. But now, what we have in Gaza, again, not mining, but now we understand that we have to have a security zone. Now we have about 1 kilometer fence. We don't want to have Gaza homes watching our civilians like spitting on them.
Yeah,
We have
yeah,
1
yeah.
kilometers total. We call it
No man's
it's
land.
no man's land. We even use, I don't like to use it, but it's like a killing zone, meaning
Yeah.
someone
Anybody,
there
you kill them.
is dead.
Right.
We wanted it.
Right.
No, as a joke, I said I would like to have it 10 kilometers, so it's up to the sea.
to the ocean, right.
But we have it 1.5 kilometers, and we learned from Gaza. We are doing the same in
the north.
the northern part, in Lebanon and Syria. And if I coming back to your remark from before, yes, it's my committee recommendation, but it started also before. We understand that containment and defense is not working, so we are exercising and we are adapting this doctrine also in Syria and in Lebanon. If you look on the ceasefire agreement in Lebanon, you'll see that every imminent threat we attack. We are not asking questions. In Gaza, everyone coming very close to our perimeter,
kill
to
them.
our security zone, is not going to happen. In Syria, we took a stripe along the border. We took the Hermon, the Syrian Hermon. We took some villages. In Lebanon, even after we withdraw from the areas that we entered, we have still 5 posts there with several hundred soldiers, keeping and making sure that no one will undermine and endanger our civilians, so we can look in their eyes and tell them you can come back home. It's not simple, but we are starting to adopt the new doctrine. Now, again, I don't want to say, I say it because everyone is very smart afterwards, but I wrote, I'm working also with some in the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. I write a lot of articles there, and I wrote an article on August 2023, a few months before, and the name of article has become viral. Israel should change or flip the diskette on the northern arena. We have to do a preemptive strike, a proactive strike, and attack the Lebanese, the Hezbollah. So if it will be a surprise, we can take in a surprise 70% of the missiles, 70% of their forces. I tried to convince, I couldn't, because the IDF and the Minister of Defense didn't want it. Why? They said it will escalate. It will make a war. And it's very, very tough to say it afterwards. But I said, so what if it will be a war? Let's make a war on our terms,
right?
Not on their terms.
On our time frame.
Exactly. It was against,
a war is coming.
Exactly. It was against like the will and the doctrine and the thinking, the wrong thinking, saying quiet
Is
is
better.
the most important thing. Let's keep it quiet. This is why the Hezbollah had the chance to have 200,000 missiles. 200,000 missiles. It's crazy. And Hamas
they did
had
it.
30,000.
Yeah.
It's crazy. It's not going to happen again. We cannot allow it. I hope, again,
Right.
I hope we will not forget it in 2, 3, 4 years, and we'll continue, make sure that it won't happen again.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to a little further beyond October 7th to the ceasefire. Now, I understand why Israel agreed to a 6-week ceasefire in mid-January, and it has to be because the Biden administration forced it to. But that ceasefire ended in February when Trump was president and when Trump gave Israel the green light. Why didn't Israel immediately restart the war efforts?
Dr. Bob, I wish you would be the one of our government and put it in the cabinet, but I'm joking, of course. Look, the reason was two that we did this ceasefire. First, that Biden administration wanted, I don't like to use the word forced.
Yeah.
You can use it, I'm not using it.
Right.
You are allowed, I'm not. They wanted it very hard, let's say this way.
Right,
And
right.
there was one more problem. This is why there is a difference between the war in Gaza and the war in Lebanon and Syria. We have the hostages. Now, Israel is the most human army, IDF, in the world. Now, we have the hostages. We started with few hundreds. Take today. We have 59 hostages there. Again, people, 36 of them are declared dead. We think 20 to 25 are still alive. I don't know, about 4 or 5 of them, we still have questions, but assume 20 of them are alive, 25 are alive. Israel did not want to jeopardize them, even before. So one of the reasons that we went to the ceasefire, it was not only because Biden forced us, was because we wanted to release as much hostages as possible. Now, there are questions, and again, I don't want to go into this debate. I will never say even one bad word about the families, about their, for every one of those families, every soldier is the whole world. And I understand them. Probably you and me, if we were in their position, we would say the same. We will, demonstrate and everything. At the end, we decided to give a chance to this ceasefire. And if the Hamas would agree to continue the ceasefire on the first stage rules, meaning every week 3 to 4 hostages release, and then we give some prisoners. Believe me, I know that it's not good. It's the least problematic point in this ceasefire because we can capture or kill them again, or some of them can be leaders. We have to make sure that we are following them. There is one thing we cannot give the Hamas. This is why this ceasefire stopped, and we are now in the second stage of the war. There are 3 goals of the war that was declared by our cabinet when we started. 1, we have to kill or capture or exile everyone that was participating in this massacre of October 7. Second, we have to totally dismantle and destroy the capabilities of Hamas, military, governmental, and civilian. And third, we have to bring back all the hostages. Not in this order. All 3 together, sometimes they contradict each other, sometimes they are coming together. The only thing, really the only thing, that we cannot give the Hamas in a ceasefire, and this is exactly what they wanted, us declaring the end of war before we achieved all those 3 war goals. We cannot give it to them because then all the sacrifices of 2,000 people that died,
wasted.
it will be wasted. Now, this is exactly what they want. So why this ceasefire collapsed? Because what we can give them, they don't want. And what they want from us, we cannot give them. So these 2 sides didn't come to an equilibrium that we can continue. We can give them a ceasefire as of the first stage. Everyone asked me, what do you think about the ceasefire? There was like 2 or 3 stages. Hey, first stage, it's okay. I don't think there will be a second stage. Why? Because both sides want things that each side cannot give to the other. And this is exactly what happened. So now Israel saying again, we are very careful. We don't want to hurt those hostages, but still, we have a new chief of staff. He is working a little bit different than before.
I hope so.
He is working a little bit different because I know him, and we are going to make sure that we are going to achieve all three war goals. Now, the biggest debate is to bring back the hostages. What is better? To give Hamas everything he wants and then continue the war? Believe me, it's not. Or to have the war and put the massive, extensive, maximum force and dangers on the Hamas leaders, their families, and their homes, and get the hostages this way. I'm not saying we'll get all the hostages. And believe me, even if we'll give Hamas everything they want, we're not going to get back all those hostages. You know why?
Of course not, because that's the leverage they have.
It's their insurance policy.
That's right.
The moment they'll give us all the hostages,
we're
believe me,
bomb the shit
if
out
there
of
was no hostages, the war in Gaza would
be
finish
over.
about a year ago.
Right.
See Hezbollah. Hezbollah is 25 to 50 times more powerful than
Hamas.
Yeah. And see, still, in much less shorter time, we really gave them so many devastating hits because we didn't have the barriers.
We don't have time.
We couldn't do in the southern
We don't
part.
have time to go into the issue of hostages, but it's in my view, I'll just give you my view, it's a total mistake. It's because Netanyahu agreed to free over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, Hamas prisoners, to get Gilad Shalit back that October 7th happened.
It's one reason. I won't say it's because of it. There are many reasons. I agree with you. It's one of the reasons.
Yahya Sinwar was one of those who was released, and he was right. So, valuing life is important. I agree, valuing life, but you have to look at the equation. You don't value life by giving up terrorists with blood on their hands for a few Jewish lives. That isn't valuing life, because those terrorists that we release will do more killing, and also it'll give more incentive to our enemies to take hostages.
I agree with you, but there was even a committee, it's called the Shamgar Committee, that gave rules of how many hostages for how many prisoners. It was never approved by the government. It came out when I was the National Security Advisor. The problem is that we are much more human than them. And again,
but you have to be longer term, and when you
I understand, but believe me, if I put on the table what bothers me in those ceasefire and the deals, the prisoners bother me a lot. It's the least problematic decision. The most important decision is we cannot allow Hamas to continue controlling Gaza. And not only Hamas, we cannot allow the Palestinian Authority to be part of it. We call it not Abbas and not Hamas. Now, this is something that it's very, very important.
Yeah.
Now, someone asked me what will be the day after. I wrote an article a week after October 7. And I said, I have a solution with one all inside. Israel should continue controlling the security and defense of Gaza for the next 100 years. The borders, the security inside. It cannot be Hamas, no tunnels, no equipment. And we have to disengage from Gaza on health, education, water, electricity, all of those kinds of things. We should not be there. We should not control Gaza. We don't want to control 2 million Palestinians. We have to control the security defense. So someone asked me, so who is going to do it? I said, this is the all in my plan. Yeah. I think that when Hamas will cease to exist, it will come to a solution. When there is still Hamas, no one wants to be held responsible on the civilian life because they understand. For example, we gave it to one family in one neighborhood. Hamas killed all the families there. Right. No one will take it while Hamas is there. Right. I think when Hamas will be no more there, the Emirates will come, Saudi will come, others will come maybe.
Others.
When there will be no Hamas.
Right.
While there is Hamas, no one will come.
Nobody. Right. Well, there is something unique that's been proposed, and Trump has a creative and ambitious plan to relocate all of the residents of Gaza to other countries and then to develop Gaza to become, as he says, the Riviera of the Middle East, which is possible. You've been there. It's a beautiful area right on the water. There's no reason it couldn't be.
It can be Singapore of the Middle East or Switzerland of the Middle East. There are many, many names. You are right. There is one hole in this plan like it was in my plan. We need to find a place that will take those Gazan people. Now, it can be in two solutions. First of all, there is an area in Gaza, like we did in the first part of the war. I'm not sure it can contain 2 million Gazans, but it can take 1.5.
Where is it? I'm confused.
There is a part in Gaza.
Yes.
We call it called the Muasi.
Yeah.
It's near the sea.
Yes.
It's all sand, so there are no tunnels there. We can put. We cannot
half
put.
of them.
We cannot half of them.
Half of them. Okay.
The best solution, and we tried to do it in the beginning of the war, is that Sisi will open his borders. Will build the 10th
Sisi,
city.
the president of Egypt.
Yes. We can build a 10th city in Sinai. There are a lot of areas there. We can promise the people there that will give them food, health, humanitarian aid as much as they can, and we can promise Sisi they will go back. He understands that this promise, and I'm sorry, is probably right. Those people that will leave Gaza would not like to come back.
Why would you
Sisi,
go back?
Sisi don't want 2 million Palestinians to become his problem. So he don't want it. He was offered billions of dollars to solve some of his biggest problem because, he have a big problem of his economy. Still, Sisi insisting not to take them. Now, Trump asked him to take them. He even threatened to cut the aid from the U.S. to Egypt. The same with other countries. Trump program is very good one if we will solve one point, to find someone that will take them temporarily or permanently. Now, some of them really want to go.
Yeah.
Some of them can go, but again, one country said, I agree to take 2,000. The other country, we need to take 2 million.
Yeah.
I couldn't find, I don't know of a country that agreed to take them permanently or
it's
temporarily.
very interesting that the EU, how many did they take when Syria was falling apart a few years ago?
They didn't take, they came and they didn't stop them.
Right.
It was not like, it was not like voluntarily taking them,
So
but sometimes they came and they didn't stop them.
Right. Well,
now, Dr. Bob, I'm with you. Let's
open a port in Gaza.
Let's make the EU take 1 million Gazans. Now, the world say, no, it's a transfer. I don't care. If the Gaza want to go out. Now, the difference is, are they going out willingly or are someone is forcing them? Now, everyone say, if they will go willingly,
of course
it's
they're going to go
it's
willingly.
Legally. Well, I think they will go willingly, but you know what Hamas will do? When we moved them from the north to the south, Hamas officers were standing and shooting them. They are shooting their own people, preventing them from going out because they wanted them
as hostages. Shields.
I call it human shields.
Human shields.
They use them as human shields. This is the craziness of Hamas using their own people as their human shields. Now, I think that if someone would try to move 2 million Gazans out, the Hamas won't let them. So the world will say, they are not moving willingly, you are forcing them out. If you will ask the Gazans, of course, many of them would like to go out.
But they can't say it.
Life in Gaza is very, very, very miserable.
Right. Next, Jacob, let's talk about Lebanon and Syria. Starting around 2008, Hezbollah started growing to become a significant military force in Lebanon. And unlike Hamas, Hezbollah is much better trained and armed than Hamas, and it's reported to have over 200,000 missiles prepared to launch at Israel. And Hezbollah, of course, joined in with Hamas, supported Hamas by firing hundreds of missiles every day toward Israel, starting on October 7th. But that all changed in September of 2024, when thousands of pagers and walkie-talkies used by Hezbollah officers suddenly exploded. Can you give us some details about that fabulous and successful covert operation?
Sure, but two sentences before. Look, the plan of Khamenei was to start with Hezbollah, and they were trained, operated. When we entered Lebanon, even before the pagers, we found below of every village, another village or two that was ready to attack Israel with a lot of ammunition, very, very, very well organized in order to go into northern part of Israel. And because we entered them, and because Sinwar started, it took out the air from the balloon of Hezbollah.
No, I didn't understand that. Wait, I didn't understand.
Okay.
Are you saying that Hezbollah was supposed to attack at the same time that
No.
Hamas?
The plan was that Hezbollah will be the one that attack Israel, not the Hamas. The plan was Hezbollah to start,
Yes. And then
Judea and Samaria to join, and only in the end, Hamas was supposed to come, and all was supposed to meet in Tel Aviv.
I see.
Now, because Hezbollah is it's the strongest one, Sinwar did it without coordinating it with Iran and Hezbollah, and he gave us, again, the chance to understand what's going on. And, it took to Hezbollah a day or two to understand also what's going on, and while they wanted something, that's it. It was too late because we had our forces in the north. They couldn't attack us in surprise anymore. This was something so-called good that happened from October 7. But going back to your question, the pagers, it was a very, very, classified. No one was talking about it. Now everyone understands it. It's the sophistication of this plan is not the technology. I'm a technological guy. It's not a big technology. But it's also technology, but the chutzpah, the Yiddish word, it's like the nerve to do something like this, to make sure that someone supply those pagers and those walkie-talkies to the Hezbollah, making sure that they will take them. And, again, I will try to be very polite here, but, those pagers usually you put in your pockets. And it was planned that when it will be operating, it will beep, they'll take it out and put it via their, ice, and so it will be exploding in the ice. And if not, it will explode in their pockets, so they are not going to be parents anymore. So most of the wounds in the Hezbollah was or down or up, both of them. And it's more important that they didn't die. They are, a living, walking symbol of what happened to Hezbollah in those days. And then after the pagers and after the walkie-talkie, Nasrallah went out. And almost all the leadership of Hezbollah went out one by one. Still, Hezbollah is a power. They still have not 200,000 missiles, but they still have tens of thousands of missiles of many kinds. But they are now deterred. You can see it now. And again, I don't want to open my mouth to the Satan, as we say in Hebrew, but we came back to a war in Gaza. There was 6 missiles yesterday. Hezbollah said they are not there on Metula. What Hezbollah did when Israel started the war again in Gaza, they didn't say we are going to join and send missiles. They are deterred. So they said, we condemn. Okay, they can condemn. They didn't say we are going to join because they understand they are very weak now and they cannot do it. The same goes for Iran. I'm sure we'll have time to talk about Iran because it's very, very important. Now, one more thing that happened, because Syria and Lebanon, you cannot differentiate in between. Until this war, the biggest path of game-changing weapons from Iran to Hezbollah went to Syria. Israel used to operate what we call the war between wars. We had 3 red lines. If there is a terror activities on our borders, if there is weapon of that are game-changing, or if there is an Iranian settlement in Syria, we are going to attack. Sometimes taking responsibility, sometimes not. Today, what happened in Syria, also the Assad regime collapsed. We didn't anticipate it would be so fast.
Yes. Now, did the fact that Hezbollah was weakened by the pagers, right, that allowed us to go into southern Lebanon and do more damage to Hezbollah?
Yes.
So all of that, because Hezbollah was now weak, it couldn't help the Syrians. Is that correct or not?
It's all correct, but I don't want, usually it's not a one point that making the difference. We entered Lebanon before the pagers. We continue to enter after the pagers. We entered more and more, and you are totally right. What happened with the pagers and the walkie-talkies weakened Hezbollah, but also our forces going in weakened them. And yes, the weakening of Hezbollah gave Al-Julani, that is called himself Ashara today, and we don't have to be mistaken with him. He is trying to be now Western, having a suit and a tie. He is a terrorist. He has to prove that he is not. He is part of Al-Qaeda.
Well, so far they're not proving that.
So far they are, I don't want to say they're okay, because they just butchered now 1,200 Alawites. I don't know. The good thing is, they are already proving they are the only one that ate Hezbollah more than us, because they think that Hezbollah brought all the misery of their people in Syria. So they are not allowing Hezbollah to work on the border between Syria and Lebanon. So they are taking this burden from us. Even so, we are still looking for it. If you look on the 3 points that Israel made, and some people said, yes, we got permission from the U.S. No way. We didn't get permission. We wrote a paper, not for permission. We noticed the United States that this is our rules for the ceasefire engagement. 3 rules.
Wait, ceasefire where? In Lebanon.
We said 3 rules. And it's exactly coming back to your words, Dr. Bob, of no more containment and defense, but offense and prevention. Rule number 1, if there is an imminent threat on our borders or the borders, we're not asking, we are acting. Even rule number 2, if there is imminent threat, even if it's very, very deep in Lebanon, we are not asking, we are acting. When we are asking, if there is a non-imminent threat. For example, we destroyed a production facility of weapons, and we see the Syrians starting to build this weapon production again. We are calling the UK, US, Lebanese, tell them, look, they are doing it. You have 6 weeks. Solve it, or you will solve it.
I see.
If it's not imminent, this is the 3rd point.
And who in Syria? This is Julani.
In Syria, it's Julani. I'm talking about Lebanon.
Okay.
In Lebanon, we are telling...
It's Hezbollah still.
Yes, but we're not talking with Hezbollah. We're talking with UK and US are the committee that's supervising the ceasefire in Lebanon, together with the Lebanese army. We tell them, if it's an imminent, we are going to attack immediately, not asking you. And they said, they don't have to say, okay, they understand it.
Yeah.
And they didn't react and say, yes, this is Israeli
prerogative.
For the first time. This is, even the Europeans, the crazy Europeans are saying it is in Israel right to do it. It's legitimate. The only time we tell them, you have to act, is if it's, not something that is an imminent threat. And on the border between Syria and Lebanon, if it's an imminent threat on us and they are not doing anything we are doing, sometimes the Syrians, Al-Julani, Ashara, he's taking care of those Hezbollah. Hezbollah is totally frustrated.
Wow.
They remember, because of this border was the main entrance of
from Iranian weapons.
We stopped the flow of weapons from, from the Lebanon air, because we are not allowing Iranian planes to land in the Lebanon airfield if we understand that it's contained weapons. The same in the sea. So Hezbollah don't have where to get his new weapons to rearm itself. Iran is trying to do it. It's very, very frustrating. They are looking all the time on ways to rearm the Hezbollah. It's not working. So at the end, you look around us, you know, Iran's plan was to build a ring of fire around Israel. And this ring of fire was based on Hezbollah, Hamas, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq. The only one that is now working is the Houthis. The militias in Iraq said, we don't want to intervene. Hezbollah is very weak. Syria is against Iran. And the PA didn't follow. Hamas is very weak. Iran is totally weak now.
So,
and
but there's
add to it that Iran is weak itself because we attacked it, and I'm sure we'll come to it later. It's a good situation. Again, I don't like that it came after that we had to suffer 2,000 people and civilians and, butchered, raped, and kidnapped, and we still have hostages. But now, around us, the ring of fire that Iran tried to build is not working.
So it's still a question to me why Hezbollah, okay, they were supposed to lead the attack, and for some reason Sinwar decided that Hamas should do it. Why didn't Hezbollah just join in? What
you're asking the $1 million question. I'll tell you the answer that I think.
Yeah.
And some of my friends agree with me, some no. Remember that Trump took down Soleimani, Qasem Soleimani, the head of the IRGC. Many people assume that if Soleimani was alive, Hezbollah would join Hamas on October 7.
I see.
Their leadership was one that it took him, like I said before, that we were in a chaos. It took them also time to understand. They didn't join. And the moment they wanted to join, it was too late because our forces
were already on the border.
Two divisions on the north protecting our borders.
I see.
So,
but what about all
this
those
is the
missiles?
reason. So this is the reason they didn't join with full force.
Yeah.
They joined with, sending 300 missiles. Now, because we took down many of their missiles by preempting a strike later, they didn't strike us with 3,000 missiles that we thought. They strike us with 300 missiles per day, like it was in the Second Lebanon War.
Mm-hmm. Amazing.
It's amazing, it's a mixture.
Amazing.
It's a mixture of consequences and things that happen.
So the removal of Soleimani was so important.
Very important. I think not everyone agree, but I have also intel to if Soleimani was alive on October 7,
he would have ordered an attack.
He would have ordered Hezbollah to join immediately.
Right.
He would understand it. He was very smart.
Well,
very smart.
Evil genius.
Evil, you know what?
Evil
it's exactly
genius.
what I will say. He was an evil genius.
And looking at him, handsome man. Ooh, but evil.
Handsome is something that,
there's one picture of him like this.
It's subjective.
No. I think if you ask people, they'd say he's a very good looking man.
He had a very nice, ring, because this is what remained from him after he was dead, is the ring that...
Oh, that's how they identified him?
Exactly.
Wow.
You saw the picture of his finger and the ring.
All right.
Not many other parts.
Were left after that was a Reaper drone,
It was a Reaper drone, not more than one. Intelligence coming from Israel, the attack coming from Trump. Fantastic. It was a good cooperation, joint cooperation.
Yeah.
And look, Trump had the guts to do it.
Right. And my friend Lyndon Blue, who runs General Atomics, he produces those Reaper drones.
You know who was the engineer that really opened General Atomic was Abraham Kiflawi. He is someone that coming from Israel. In his life, Israel didn't believe in the beginning, so he went to the States, and then we did drones, and then he opened General Atomics in the United States.
I heard that.
Abraham Kiflawi.
Yeah, I've heard that
from
my
English
friend
name. I don't know what his name,
Zvi Maron, who knows him.
Yeah, Zvi Maron also knows him.
Yeah.
This guy was a genius, drone genius. Wow. And he opened General Atomics.
Yeah.
You're right. General Atomics have made a lot of money out of those drones.
Mm-hmm. Now, getting back to Syria, is it really a country, or is it a geographical area on a map that somebody drew in which various regions are controlled by clans?
You know, what you're saying now is very important, because some people, when they ask what will happen with Syria,
Yeah.
are pointing what you're saying, because Syria is not a really country.
Right.
You go back to the agreements of,
The British.
the definition of countries there. It's a, it's a mixture of many, tribes, and some people say the good solution for Syria
Is to break
is
it
to
up.
cut it. Druze, Kurds,
Right.
Alawite. I'm not sure it will happen, but you're right. Syria is not a real country.
Yeah.
It's a join of many, many tribes that became a country.
And that
What
hate
will
each
happen,
other,
What
right?
will happen from them? What will happen with them in the future? I'm not sure. I don't know. I think no one knows. But I hope what you just said will be correct, and Syria will become, colonies of, 6, 7 places. The Druze close to Israel. They are now. We opened the border, and some of the Druze in
they're
Syria
allowed to work
are coming
now?
to work in Israel.
Excellent.
Sometimes they are even combining with their families in Majdal Shams, in the Golan Heights. It's also, dangerous inside, because some of them, not all of them, are Israeli lovers. We have to make sure that we are not bringing
Right.
problems, but it's good that we will help the Druze, the Kurds in the north. I hope the U.S. will not desert them, because until now the U.S. supported the Kurds in the north. There is still a problem with the Turks, because the Turks want to eliminate the Kurds.
We're going to get into that.
Okay.
So, so Assad was an enemy of Israel. He was allowing weapons to come into the country that then went to Lebanon. So does the fall of Assad help Israel? How does it affect Israel's security now?
Again, I don't want to be too happy.
Yeah.
Yes, you can say that Assad falling helped Israel, but it's too early to have a final decision, because we have to see
HTS.
what will happen. It's HTS,
Yeah.
how it will work. Also, I wrote in my recommendation of the committee, and here you see how reporters are twisting things. I wrote there, look, there is no vacuum. And Turkey entered Syria. They have, even in mind, they have ambitions to build 2 air bases in Hama and Homs, two cities in the northern part of Syria. And they are even talking about building an air base in Damascus. They want to fill in for the Russians. Now I wrote, look, Turks are part of NATO. They are not our enemies. But in order not to make again another mistake like October 7, we have to watch the Turks. Now what the reporters wrote, the Nagel Committee report recommend that Israel will prepare itself to a war with Turkey. I never said so.
Right.
But reporters can say whatever you want. But still there is a problem with just yesterday or even today, I think, Prime Minister Netanyahu, it was in there, he is doing a special meeting in the cabinet to make sure that we are preparing ourselves not to war, but we have to make sure that we know what the Turks are doing. We should not neglect anything, like we are watching Egypt or Turkey or every other enemy that is not part of our enemies. We have a peace agreement with Jordan, with Egypt. Of course, in Turkey, they are not our enemies.
Well,
but they can become, and you have to make sure that we are looking of what's going on. We cannot neglect anything. This is the world of Israel. We cannot neglect. We have everyone around us. No, I call it, we are the villa in the jungle, and all the other animals want to eat us. The only way to survive in jungle is to be strong.
To be strong. So we don't know Turkey's intentions in Syria. Is it to become the leader of the Arabs, as Egypt once was, or as Iran wants to be?
They don't consider themselves to be the leaders of the Arabs. Some say, and I don't want, sometimes it's.
But they're Sunnis, right?
I've been. But I've been. They are not. They are not Sunnis and not Shiite. There are Sunnis, there are Shiite, and there are the Muslim Brotherhood. The Turks are the Muslim Brotherhood like Qatar. It's Turks and Qatar, and they are the enemies of Egypt. Now, the Turks, some people say that Erdogan want to bring back the Ottoman Empire.
Yes.
He want to be, I don't know, Genghis Khan. I don't want to say so.
Right.
Some people are quoting it wrongly. I don't know what he want.
Right.
He have now his own problems inside Turkey. You know that there are
Kurds.
riots.
The
also
riots.
inside Turkey, there are riots in Istanbul.
Yeah.
I don't know what will happen in Turks. We don't want the Turks as our enemies. But we have to take care what they're doing.
Don't you remember when the ship, the Maru?
The Marmara.
Right.
I was the one that was ordered by Netanyahu together with a guy named, unfortunately he died, he was 92, Yossi Chekhanouver. We got the mission from Netanyahu to negotiate a deal with Turkey to make not peace, but to solve the Marmara. And we negotiated the deal. We gave the families. We didn't agree to say that we were the one to blame.
But I remember.
But we gave the families a compensation of, I think it was $1 million per each. We gave about 20 million. We wanted it, the one that pushed us for this.
It was Obama.
Exactly.
I remember.
It was a guy that you like very much.
I remember.
His name was Obama.
He was on the phone.
He came to Israel.
And he said, you have to apologize.
Not on the phone. He
was in person.
He started on the phone.
Yeah.
2013, he came to Israel.
Yeah.
And before he went back on the plane, Netanyahu with him were on the,
tarmac.
On the
runway.
on the runway. He took the phone and said, here is Erdogan on the phone. Talk to him. I want you to
apologize.
Not apologies. I want you to, orchestrate two sides to sit together and come to an agreement. So it was two of our side. I was one of these two. And two from the Turkish side. We decided not in Turkey and not in Israel. So we sat once in Vienna, and I don't want to say the other place. We sat many times. They came at the end to Israel once. We didn't want to go to Turkey. We came to an agreement that because it's human, we gave compensation to the families without taking responsibility of what happened, because they came.
Of course. They were trying to break a blockade.
At the end, some people died. You say, okay, for the families, we are willing to give the money. It was a $20 million compensation or something like this. They started the negotiation. They wanted from us that they can bring whatever they want to Gaza. We told them, no way. You want to bring to Gaza? Every humanitarian aid you want, you can bring. Blankets, toys, medicine.
Whatever, yeah.
This you can bring, not anything else. This was the end. We didn't allow them. They said, you want to have an agreement? Break the
blockade.
The blockade.
Absolutely.
No way.
Yeah.
The only thing we agreed is to give them a 20 million compensation for the families of those that died. This is the only thing that we so-called. It was a little bit push from Obama.
I thought, as I recall, but I recall incorrectly, the Prime Minister Netanyahu was on the phone and had to apologize for it.
He didn't apologize.
Okay.
He didn't apologize. At the end, he didn't apologize.
Okay. Now,
you are right. He wanted him. He didn't apologize.
As I understand it, Turkey has been at war with the Kurds on its own territory and in Syria, where the U.S. has been supporting the Kurds. Do you expect the U.S. to continue to support the Kurds in Syria? And if so, how is this going to affect the relationship between the U.S. and Turkey?
You're asking me now not to talk as an Israeli expert, but as a worldwide expert. It's a little bit above my pay grade, but I will try to answer a little bit. I hope. I'm not controlling it. I don't know what will happen, because remember that in the beginning, it was Obama and then Biden and even Trump saying America first. So they want to withdraw from Syria. I hope that the U.S. will understand that they have to keep their forces in Syria. They have to protect the Kurds. Otherwise, the Turks will butcher them. If there is not going to be Americans there, the Kurds will be finished. This is the biggest aim of the Turks, to finish the Kurds, and so it will affect also the Kurds in Turkey. I hope it won't happen. Now, the relations between Turkey and U.S. was up and down, up and down. Remember that at the end, Turkey is part of NATO. That's
another question I have.
Yes, it's part of NATO. Right. Now, I don't know what will happen. I don't remember that someone was expelled from NATO. I don't want. It's really a matter that is not for Israel to deal with.
No, I just thought that you might.
I don't know what will happen there.
Mm-hmm.
Again, Turkey is a big country in our Middle East. I don't want Turkey as our enemy.
Right.
I don't know if you know it. Even with the boycott that Erdogan said on Israel, like the economical relations, still, between Israel and Turkey, it's the biggest economy relations still.
Of all of Israel's other...
Yes, around us, right. Because both countries need it, and they find a way around it.
I see.
When money comes to play, we are buying pistachios, we get oil, they are buying other things, there are machines. At the end, there is still a lot of economical relations between Israel and Turkey. At the end, we can do it.
There's just so much to talk about with Jacob Nagel that we've decided to cut it into 2 separate episodes. And so I'm going to say goodnight to him now, and then we'll probably say good morning to him when he's back in Israel.
Very good. I really enjoyed it, and I'm always at your disposal when you need another part of this episode. It's very important to talk on all about those issues. It's important for Israel, it's important for the United States, it's important for your audience.
Well, I really appreciate your openness and your willingness to spend time with me and to let our audience in on these stories about what's really happening that not necessarily is being reported in the news. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we'll be recording another podcast with you when you're back in Israel.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. And if you enjoyed this episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob, please subscribe and you'll be automatically notified of future podcasts in this series.
Thanks so much for listening to another episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob. If you enjoyed these interviews with some of today's most influential thought leaders, please follow and rate the show on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget, you can also watch each episode on YouTube as well. We'll see you next time.